So lately, I feel like, well, everyone's been on this AI deep dive. And honestly, who can blame anyone, right? It's like we're all just waiting to find out if robots are going to be asking us for resumes or, what we want for lunch next. You sent over some really interesting stuff. Sam Altman's been talking about superintelligence on his blog. There's that wild data from Epoch AI, and even some videos from David Shapiro, you know him, always digging into the details.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating time to be looking into this stuff. And, you've hit on some of the biggest questions people are wrestling with. Like, how fast is AI actually developing? Is this intelligence explosion thing really going to happen? And if it does, what will that even look like for, everyone?
Yeah. And Altman really doesn't hold back, does he? 1,000 days to superintelligence. I mean, that practically is next Tuesday as far as the tech world's concerned. I gotta say, though, that Epoch AI research you sent, it kind of makes his timeline seem, well, not so crazy.
Right. I mean, predictions are one thing, but the data Epoch AI is putting out there, that's really something else. They've been tracking how fast AI has been growing, the capabilities, how much computing power is going into it, the data, even the energy consumption. It's honestly kind of mind-blowing.
Like Moore's Law squared, right?
Yeah.
For anyone who's not familiar, we're not just talking about things getting a little better each year. It's like orders of magnitude smarter, potentially in a really short time.
Exactly. And what I find so interesting is that even Shapiro, and he loves to take stuff apart and get into the weeds, even he's saying that an intelligence explosion is looking more and more likely.
That's what really got my attention too. He's got that video, straight lines on a logarithmic scale, where he goes through Altman's blog, the Epoch AI stuff, all of it. And he basically concludes like, yep, this intelligence explosion thing, it's probably happening.
It's not just the techies or the super optimistic futurists saying it anymore. It's one thing to say, oh, AI is getting smarter, but a real intelligence explosion, that's a whole other ballgame.
Okay, so let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're all on board now, intelligence explosion's coming, probably sooner than we think.
Hmm.
Where does Shapiro go from there? Because he doesn't seem like the kind of guy to just throw his hands up and say, well, we're all doomed.
Not at all. And that's what makes his perspective so valuable, I think. He gets into this idea that even if we have superintelligence, on demand, there are still going to be these constraints, real-world constraints, he calls them. And it's not like AI running out of memory or something.
This is where his analogies really clicked for me. Like when he talks about the Large Hadron Collider, right? Insanely complex technology, took decades, tons of international cooperation to build. Or the James Webb Telescope, another scientific marvel years in the making.
He's making the point that even with the absolute smartest people we've got working on these projects, they were still held back by things that go beyond intelligence. And it's not even just like running out of rare earth minerals or whatever to build data centers, though that is a real concern too.
Right. It's a lot bigger than that. So what are those real-world constraints Shapiro is talking about? If even superintelligence has to play by these rules, what are they?
He kind of breaks it down into a few main categories. First, you've got the resource constraints, like we were saying, the raw materials, energy production, that sort of thing. These giant AI models, they take massive amounts of power to run. Even if we completely solve renewable energy, scaling that up to meet the demand, that's, well, a pretty huge task.
And then there's just the fact that some things, they just take time. Doesn't matter how smart the AI gets, right? It can't make a plant grow any faster. It can't make a scientific experiment give you results in an instant.
You got it. Think about things like growing a culture in a lab, seeing the long-term effects of a new drug, even just building something incredibly complex and detailed. There's some processes that take a certain amount of time. That's just how the world works. And AI can't cheat that.
Okay, I'm with you on those two. But Shapiro also talks about, like, the human factor. Is he saying that our good old-fashioned human messiness, how unpredictable we are, could actually be the thing that, like, throws a wrench in the gears of this whole intelligence explosion?
It might sound a little strange, but yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. He's talking about how things like, how political systems work, economic stuff, even just good old human stubbornness or just being resistant to change, those things can all slow things down. Even progress that's being driven by superintelligence.
And this is where it feels like things get really interesting, especially with all the stuff you've been looking into lately. Because this whole intelligence explosion thing, it's not just some, like, far-off sci-fi idea anymore, is it? It's got some real-world stuff attached to it, especially when we're talking about jobs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the big question, right? What happens to us, to how we make a living when you've got AI that can maybe do everything we can, but do it better, do it cheaper?
Yeah, and Altman in that blog post, he kind of just skims over that whole part, doesn't he? Says something about jobs changing more slowly than expected, which I don't know about you, but that doesn't exactly fill me with confidence.
Yeah, it's a tad vague. Shapiro, though, he lays out a much more bracing, maybe, kind of scenario. He calls it the automation cliff.
Okay, so no more like slow and easy retirement for everybody once the robots take over. What is this automation cliff all about?
So basically, he's arguing that there'll be jobs, right? Right up until the moment that AI can do that very last one. And then dot, boom. It's like a sudden drop, a cliff, not some gradual thing where the job slowly disappears.
So not like we'll see fewer jobs over years and years. It's more like someone just flips a switch and what, millions of jobs are just poof, gone.
That's the fear, yeah. And it's not totally unrealistic either. And this is where it gets real for people, I think, especially, well, for someone like you, right?
Yeah.
Who's been playing around with those AI art tools. Shapiro actually talks about this in his video, uses himself as an example. He used Midjourney to make the cover art for his book, that AI art generator.
Good cover. I'll give him that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. He's saying that not only was the AI art better than what he probably could have gotten from, like, a lot of human artists, but it was also cheaper.
Yeah.
And faster.
Wow. See, I get how AI could replace like factory jobs or, I don't know, driving trucks.
Right.
But when you start talking about creative work, art, I mean, that always felt different, human.
That's what makes the whole thing so, I don't know, powerful, right? Because one thing if it's AI doing work that's like repetitive or maybe physically dangerous, but when you see AI being really good at creative stuff we associate with, well, with being human, it hits different. That automation cliff starts to feel a lot more real.
Yeah. I bet that's getting home for a lot of people listening right now. So let's say we believe this whole automation cliff thing. Then what? What do we do about it? Usually I hear people saying universal basic income or find meaning outside of work, man. But you were saying earlier that Shapiro doesn't think those are good enough. Why not?
He's got some pretty strong opinions on both of those. Let's take UBI first. So Shapiro, his argument is that UBI, it makes everybody rely on the government, which in a world where it's AI running the economy, maybe not the best idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger problem he has is that UBI, it's well-meaning and all, but it actually takes away some of your economic agency.
What do you mean?
Like your ability to kind of make your own way, economically speaking.
Right.
If all your money's coming from a government check, it doesn't matter how hard you work, how many side hustles you've got going, you're kind of stuck, right?
Yeah, okay. It keeps the lights on, but it doesn't really give you the chance to, I don't know, build something for yourself, be creative with how you make a living.
Right. And then the whole meaning economy idea, everyone becomes an artist or whatever Shapiro's point is. Not everyone's cut out for that, and they shouldn't have to be. Those fields are already super competitive, even without AI trying to get in on the action.
Okay, so what's the alternative? If UBI is not it, and not everyone can be selling like AI-generated pottery online, what's Shapiro's solution?
This is where he gets really out there. In a good way, I think. He's got this whole framework, he calls it post-labor economics. And it's really different from how we think about work, about ownership, about everything, really.
All right, now you've got me intrigued. Hit me with it. What does post-labor economics even mean? Post-labor economics. It kind of sounds like, I don't know, something out of Star Trek, right? But it's also a little, I don't know, unnerving. Like, what do we even do all day if nobody has to work? Shapiro's got some ideas about this, I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah, he definitely does. He lays out these, like, 4 main parts of what he calls post-labor economics. In that video, he talks about collective ownership, decentralization, transparent governance, and then consensus-based decision-making.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. What's the deal with this whole collective ownership thing? Are we talking like full-on communism, everybody shares everything?
Not quite that far, though. It is a pretty big change from how we usually think about things.
Yeah.
He's basically saying we need to move away from, like, this obsession with private ownership, especially when we're talking about stuff that's, really important for everyone to, like, survive and have a good life.
Okay, so like what kind of stuff are we talking about here?
Thinking about things like, I don't know, farmland, water rights, the electric grid, even those giant data centers where all this AI stuff is running. Shapiro's saying that stuff like that, it shouldn't be controlled by, like, a handful of companies or billionaires. It should be managed, like, collectively for everyone's benefit.
Right, but how do you even start to, like, organize something like that? Managing stuff on that scale, I mean, that sounds incredibly complicated.
And that's where the whole decentralization thing comes in. That's his second big idea. This is where he starts talking about blockchain DAOs. Those are like decentralized autonomous organizations, Basically, think of an organization that's run by computer code instead of a CEO. It's all about moving away from these like top-down power structures that can, get corrupted, taken over, whatever.
Whoa. So instead of a few people at the top making all the decisions, it's more like everyone has a say.
That's the general idea.
Mm.
Though, he's definitely not saying it's going to be easy. And then to make sure we're not just trading one set of problems for another, he talks about transparent governance. That's his third pillar.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following. So, like, we all become experts in how the blockchain works and audit the AI overlords or something?
Not exactly, but like imagine a world where all the data that's used to train the AI, all the decisions it's making, even like how it's making those decisions, it's all out in the open on a public blockchain that anyone can look at, make sure everything's on the up and up. Transparency is important.
Right. So we can see what the AI is doing, make sure it's not, like, going rogue or whatever.
Exactly. And to make sure all that oversight isn't just left to like a few tech geniuses, he talks about consensus-based decision making, which is where things get really interesting, I think. He's basically saying we need to move past the way we usually do voting, which, let's face it, can be kind of easily messed with, and find new ways to figure out what people really want.
So we're not just swapping out politicians for AI. It's more about building a system where everyone actually has a voice.
Exactly. And, he's the first to admit that this is all like pretty theoretical. There are tons of challenges to figure out.
Mm.
But he thinks that talking about this stuff now, while AI is still, kind of in its early stages, that's super important if we want to make sure this technology actually helps everybody.
Well, this whole deep dive has been, I don't know, a lot to process. It's a lot to wrap your head around. It definitely feels like, the future is coming at us fast. But it's also kind of inspiring, right? I mean, it feels like we actually have some choices to make. Like we can actually shape
Yeah.
what this all looks like.
And, sometimes that's what it takes, that willingness to just like dive into something new and complicated, really try to understand these big ideas,
Hmm.
even when they make you a little uncomfortable.
Totally. So to everyone listening, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed right now, that's okay. Like we just jumped into the deep end of the pool. The important thing is to stay curious, keep asking questions. The future isn't set in stone. It's up to all of us to figure out what we want it to be.